Hi, I'm Ellen Daniels, Executive Director of the Mississippi Book Festival. COVID forced us to cancel our in-person event in August, but thanks to the incredible response from over 100 authors and moderators, we have recorded more than 30 official panels, which you can now find on our website. A big thank you goes to our funders, our presenting sponsor, the Community Foundation for Mississippi, and Trustmark Bank, which has provided support for this virtual edition. The panel you're about to see is brought to you by these generous funders. All of us at the Mississippi Book Festival are grateful for your continued support. We look forward to seeing you next year and in person on August 20th. Happy reading!
Hi, I'm Katie Blount. I'm Director of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, and I'm thrilled to be here for the Mississippi Book Festival panel interview with Kai Bird, an award-winning author, historian, and journalist. He is Executive Director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, and he's the author of a number of biographies. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography for American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer. And his most recent book is The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter. It is a wonderful biography, and I am excited to talk about it. Kai, tell us a little bit about this book and how you came to write it.
Well, thank you, Katie, for having me. I wish I could be in Mississippi in person, but COVID intervened. Well, Jimmy Carter's been on my mind actually for more than 30 years. After I finished my first biography in 1992, I was sort of early 91, I was casting around for a new project, and I thought, well, maybe a president would be fun to do. And I was always interested in Carter and his one-term presidency. So I went down to Atlanta and spent 2 weeks and interviewed a bunch of his aides. The Carter Center had just opened up in Atlanta. And he was doing all these wonderful things with his ex-presidency. This is in 1990. And I thought I'd explore the notion of doing a biography by writing a magazine article, a profile about what he was doing with his ex-presidency. And I did the piece, nice essay, cover story.
Kai?
Yes?
Kai, you froze there for a minute. So I would go back to maybe you went to Georgia.
Yes. So I went down to Georgia and I started interviewing some of his aides at the Carter Center, where he had just opened up the Carter Center. And my plan was to do a magazine piece about his ex-presidency as a means of exploring whether a presidential biography was a viable option. And I did the story. I had a short telephone interview with Carter himself and published the piece, but I concluded that it was too early. His presidential archives were still basically closed. Everything was still classified, this being only 10 years after he'd left the White House. And also I realized from my visit in Georgia that I was a foreigner down there. And I didn't understand the accent, and I didn't understand his religion, Southern Baptist. Mm-hmm. And I didn't understand the South. I didn't understand race. It was like really a foreign country. And I came back and told my wife that if I was going to do this, we'd have to move to Plains, Georgia. And seep into South Georgia and cover it like a foreign correspondent and learn all about the South. And my wife said no.
Yeah, no surprise.
But I then went on to another project, but I came back to it in 2015. I was still very curious about this guy, Jimmy Carter, and his odyssey, politically and otherwise. And I spent 6 years on the book from 2015 to 21. And I still think I don't understand the South, but I know a
Well,
little more.
it's interesting that you say that, because I was fascinated to read in your prologue that that you had intended just to cover the Carter presidency, but as you started getting into the work, you realized that you really couldn't explain Carter and his presidency without delving into his life growing up in the Deep South. Talk about what led you to that conclusion, and then how your thoughts about Carter as a Southerner shaped the work.
Yeah, no, it was very clear. I started out wanting to just do the 4 White House years. But when I started to write, I wrote a little introduction about where he had come from and how he had come out of nowhere to win the presidency in a very improbable campaign. And the introduction grew from 10 pages to 20 to 50. And then I realized I was writing the whole life. And, it was an interesting story. It's just, he grew up, I just became enthralled with his childhood and where he came from. And the fact that he really had one foot in the 19th century, growing up in Archery, not even Plains, tiny little hamlet outside of Plains. And his only playmates were African-American kids, the sons and daughters of sharecroppers and tenants. His father owned probably several thousand acres of land, and they grew peanuts and corn. And he grew up in a Sears and Roebuck kit house that was put together. There was no running water, no electricity. There was an outhouse in the back, and he would argue with his parents every year about whether he had to wear shoes. And, it was just, it's an incredible odyssey that he came from this 19th century kind of farming community where mules were still pulling plows, and became president of the United States. And he was the first president from the Deep South, really ever. I don't count Andrew Jackson. And, and he won the South in 76. And then in 1980, he lost the South. He was rejected by his own people and much of the rest of the country. And, that's an incredible story.
So one interesting aspect of that story is his evolution on race. He ran when he ran for governor in 1970. He ran a fairly traditional white Southern racist. I mean, you could say it was muted racism, but it wasn't that muted campaign. And in fact, he told Vernon Jordan, "You won't like my campaign, but you'll like my administration." And then he came out in his inaugural speech and said, "The time for discrimination is over." Was that an actual evolution in his heart or just politics?
That was his Machiavellian strength, character. I mean, he was extremely ambitious and very intelligent and clever. He knew exactly what was necessary to get elected, and he as you
froze after Kai. You froze after exactly. He knew exactly.
Well, let me go back. This will be edited.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Well, yes, this was his Machiavellian character. He really was extremely ambitious and very clever. He knew politically what was necessary to get elected. He had run in '66 for governor, and he'd run there a more conventional liberal campaign and he lost. and lost to Lester Maddox. And he was just personally ashamed that he had lost to someone like Lester Maddox. And so he began running almost immediately again. And this time he was going to be ruthless. He really was, he had decided he would do what was necessary. So as you have hinted, he really walked right up to the line with racial dog whistles, talking about how he understood the concerns of parents in rural Georgia who wanted to send their kids to Christian academies. And so that was kind of a dog whistle. But at the same time, he was the first Georgia politician who was willing to go into African-American churches and campaign, and he felt entirely comfortable there. You know, he could get up in the front of the church and give a rousing sermon, and he knew the hymns, and he was really comfortable around African Americans. And yet he was also, you know, talking about, well, you can be conservative, but you don't have to be a racist to be a conservative. And he was giving all sorts of mixed signals. And he won. And then on the day he was inaugurated, he famously got up in his speech and said, the time for segregation in the South is over, shocking everyone on the stage. And it was regarded sort of as a betrayal. So Jimmy Carter's a very complicated guy. You know, Hunter Thompson, the Rolling Stone gonzo journalist, when he first met Jimmy Carter in 1974, he thought he was the most ruthless politician he'd ever seen.
I wrote down this quote that you included. Bill Moyers, after interviewing Carter in 1976, said that he was cold, tough, terrifyingly self-confident. He's not a real Baptist, said Moyer. I know the Baptists. He's a Calvinist. That's rough. And I didn't really see you pushing back. I mean, obviously you portray him in a more complex way than Bill Moyers, but you don't really push back against this idea that he was hard to like, pious, arrogant, self-righteous.
Yeah.
Is that right?
No, even in his 90s. I mean, he's now 96. Next month, he's going to turn 97. And I was interviewing him the last few years. And even then, he was pretty intimidating.
Yeah.
Those bright blue eyes.
Yeah.
That determined sort of relentlessness about him. He's devoted to his work. I mean, he was giving me 45 minutes at a shot for my interviews, and he would be looking at his watch if he got bored, because he had work to do. He was working to wipe out guinea worm disease and bring peace to the Syrian civil war. And that's what his real concern was. And it's always been work, work, work. You know, he's still, until I think he still sort of keeps farmer's hours. He gets up at 5:30 or 6, and work is his whole life. And he was never very good at glad handing or wheeling and dealing with politicians. That just didn't interest him. He was like Obama in that way. Yeah, he's a very tough cookie in my book.
His first year, as you describe in the book, he was incredibly productive. The Panama Canal Treaty, he had domestic accomplishments on energy, civil rights, Social Security, student loans, amnesty for draft evaders, got rid of some expensive and inefficient defense programs, but he didn't really get credit for his accomplishments then or ever. Do you think that was because of his personality, or because he was Southern and the Washington establishment refused to take him seriously?
Well, he was, an odd duck in Washington, D.C. in terms of the Georgetown set and the Washington establishment. They just couldn't figure out who this guy was. And he had a first good year in the White House. And as you are pointing out, he had a heavy legislative agenda and passed a lot of it. And he took on some really tough issues like the Panama Canal Treaty. He appointed all sorts of Ralph Naderites to regulatory positions and accomplished a lot on behalf of consumers. So, you know, seatbelts became mandatory, and airbags, thus saving 9,000 American lives every year ever since. But he ran into a lot of sort of cultural disconnect, I would argue. And yes, it was because he sort of talked funny. And he was never a great sort of orator.
Right.
And he was terrible in front of a TV camera. He was very convincing and empathetic, you know, in a small living room or a small town hall setting, where he could be spontaneous, and but he was just terrible at reading a speech.
Right.
On top of that, he ran into a press corps here in Washington that just was eager to find any fault. I mean, this was just a few years after Watergate,
right,
which of course were the two events that probably paved the way for Jimmy Carter to get elected.
Right.
But for journalists, I remember as a young reporter in my 20s here in Washington, I was, my aspiration was to become like Carl Bernstein or Bob Woodward and unearth scandal.
Right.
And, so he got a really rough time from the Washington press corps. Sally Quinn, the style section reporter married to Ben Bradley, the editor of the Washington Post, was writing these very snarky profiles of Carter and the Georgia boys and Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell, and painting them as sort of country bumpkins.
Right.
And it was really, it was pretty outrageous.
Yeah, I actually grew up in Washington, D.C. during the Carter years, and I remember that kind of sense of him as a bumpkin, which is so ironic because he was a brilliant man with, wide interest and accomplishments. I mean, he described himself in his campaign book. He said, "I am a Southerner and an American. I am a farmer, an engineer, a father and a husband, a Christian, a politician and a former governor, a planner, a businessman, a nuclear physicist, a naval officer, a canoeist, and among other things, a lover of Bob Dylan's songs and Dylan Thomas's poetry." He was not a bumpkin. And that was probably part of what the snarky Washington press couldn't accept about him.
Yeah, exactly. And, they went after him for the Burt Lance sort of banking scandal. They actually tried to investigate the peanut warehouse, and there was a sort of mini investigative moment where they alleged that he may have used money from the peanut warehouse in his campaign, which would have been illegal. And it was all much ado about nothing.
Right. He was squeaky clean.
He was very squeaky clean.
Suffered from coming into office in the aftermath of Watergate.
Yeah.
You offer really sensitive and complex portrayals of not only Carter, but his aides. And you really, I think, give a balanced view of their strengths and their faults. And those portrayals are fascinating. But I think, is it fair to say that National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski was just simply a disaster, that he was obsessed with communism to a degree that distorted his judgment on foreign policy issues, and there wasn't much good to say about his work under the Carter administration?
Well, I've been criticized for being too harsh on poor Zbig Brzezinski, but actually, since the book has come out, I've had not one, but just multiple communications from former Carter aides saying I got that exactly right, that Zbig was difficult, arrogant, just relentless in pushing his worldview,
Right.
which is very much the worldview of a Polish aristocrat, the son of a Polish diplomat, who, looked at the world through the lens of the Cold War and his hatred of the Russians. And so he saw, any issue, whether it was the Middle East or China or the problems of Central America, he saw those issues through the lens of, how can we hurt the Russians in this way?
Right.
And this introduced a distortion. And Carter, what I couldn't figure out for the longest time, and it's still sort of a mystery, is why he tolerated Zbig Brzezinski's, because he basically disagreed with Brzezinski's worldview. He sided more often with his Secretary of State, Cy Vance. But Carter he enjoyed sparring intellectually with Brzezinski, even though he disagreed with him. And early in that first year in the White House, I remember at one point, Brzezinski is constantly sending Carter memos, telling him, you've got to be tough. You've got to send a message to the Russians and maybe do something militaristic. And Carter would write in the margins of that memo, like Mayaguez, the famous incident off the coast of Cambodia that involved U.S. military force all for nothing. It was a disaster that led to the loss of life needlessly. And so Carter was he had a strong aversion to using military force.
Right.
And Brzezinski was constantly trying to get him to use American military power in a way that Carter thought was dangerous.
Right. You definitely were not alone in that view. You quoted Mississippian Hiding Carter, who was a State Department spokesman in the Carter administration. He said it was difficult to know from afar why and how the president placed so much value on Brzezinski, a second-rate thinker in a field infested with posers and careerists. He has never let consistency get in the way of self-promotion or old theories impede new policy acrobatics.
I love that quote.
Yeah, it's pretty great. It's pretty great. So if there's a villain in the book, it's Brzezinski. And if there's a hero, it's Miss Lillian Carter, Carter's mother, who was a lifelong advocate for racial justice, joined the Peace Corps at age 67 and went to India, and had a great sense of humor and a sharp tongue. Talk about Miss Lillian.
Wow, she's just a wonderful character, and very much in the tradition of the Southern eccentric old lady who can break all the social norms and rules and get away with it, and is tolerated because everyone regards her as eccentric.
Right.
But so she would go around, and I think in 1964 she was in charge of the Lyndon Johnson campaign for president in South Georgia. And growing up, young Jimmy Carter witnessed his mother telling neighbors that Abraham Lincoln was a great man. And, of course, you didn't often hear that from the South in the 1920s or 30s. So she was very outspoken, and, a real contrast too from his father, who was the sort of harsh traditional disciplinarian, a white man who believed in white supremacy. And that was, clearly not what Miss Lillian thought. And Jimmy Carter was clearly heavily influenced by Miss Lillian.
Yes, yeah, that's clear. So let's talk about some of his some of the big foreign policy issues during his administration. In 1978, in an effort to bring peace to the Middle East, he hosted Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin at Camp David for days and days of negotiations that led to the Camp David Accords. And you give a fascinating play-by-play account, really in depth, of those days that shows Carter to be tough and resourceful and creative and flexible, you know, not necessarily the way we had thought of him up until that point. Talk about the Camp David negotiations, if you would.
Well, you know, Carter actually had quite a few foreign policy achievements. You know, he normalized relations with China. He negotiated the SALT II arms control agreement with the Soviets. But I think sort of in retrospect, historians look at those two events and say, well, these things would have happened anyway. But you come to Camp David in the Middle East, and that would not have happened without Jimmy Carter. It was his personal diplomacy. It was just an amazing performance to bring these two ardent adversaries, enemies, Menachem Begin of Israel and Anwar Sadat of Egypt, together for 13 days at Camp David. And, you know, they refused, after the first day, they couldn't talk to each other. So Carter would be going back and forth between the various cabins, relaying their negotiating positions and trying to narrow their differences. And, you know, it broke down several times. Both Sadat and Begin at one point or another called for the helicopter to leave.
Mm-hmm.
But Carter would always find some way to keep them there and keep them in play. And he finally negotiated what we call the Camp David Accords, which 10 months later led in the spring of '79 to an actual peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. And you know, this story has been told in some detail before, but I bring new sources to it. And I also, I think, explain in a new way how Carter ardently believed that he had negotiated not just a separate peace between Israel and Egypt, but actually the makings of a comprehensive peace that would include the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. He believed, and I argue quite, you know, with new evidence, that Carter believed that he had gotten Menachem Begin to agree to a 5-year freeze on all the settlements in the West Bank. And, you know, at the time, there were only about 20,000 settlers in the West Bank. Today, there are over 700,000. And Carter thinks that he got Begin to agree to a 5-year settlement, freeze of the settlements. And if that had happened, we wouldn't be in this position today. But Begin quickly reneged within days. And, you know, Begin, I argue, either lied or he just misled the president. Mm-hmm. And Carter believes that he was misled or lied to. And for 40 years, he's been trying to push the Israelis to stop building those damn settlements because he understood that they were the obstacle to a really comprehensive peace. And that if they continue to build more settlements and in the West Bank, there'll be no opportunity for a two-state solution, and this will change the nature of the Israeli state. And you know, and here we are. He turns out to have been very prophetic.
Do you think that work was his greatest accomplishment?
Well, in the field of foreign affairs, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it was also, ironically, it's both his biggest accomplishment and it's his greatest disappointment too, because of what I've just been arguing, that it failed to actually solve the Palestinian issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Begin comes off as even more difficult than Carter.
Yes.
Let's talk about Iran. Carter decided under great pressure to allow the deposed Shah of Iran into the US to receive medical treatment. And that prompted the students in Iran to overrun the embassy and take 60-some hostages in 1979. That really shaped and hung over the rest of his presidency.
Yeah, no, it probably explains why he didn't get a second term. It was a disaster. But I argue in the book that if you look at what was happening in Iran, there was nothing that Carter could have done to have saved the Shah. The revolution was a very organic thing. It was in the making for years, and it just happened on his watch in late 78, early 79. And again, coming back to Zbig Brzezinski, his national security advisor, Zbig, was pushing Carter to try to have a coup d'etat, have the military crack down. This was completely unrealistic. And then after Khomeini came to power and began to cement his rule and create this theocratic republic, Islamic Republic, Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller and John McCloy, the powerful Wall Street Wall Street lawyer connected to the Rockefellers, they actually formed a organization, and they gave it the title Project Alpha, and they allocated tens of thousands of dollars to this and hired a publicist. And each of them set up on a weekly basis a calendar so that each one of them, Henry Kissinger or David Rockefeller, would personally lobby some high-ranking member of the Carter administration to give the Shah political asylum. Recall, the Shah had lost power, but he hadn't come to America right away. He'd gone to Egypt and then Panama. And so his friends, Rockefeller and Kissinger, were just relentless in lobbying Carter to give the Shah political asylum. And Carter said no repeatedly. And you can see in his personal diary, his concern was that if he gave the Shah political asylum and he came to America, this would inflame passions again in Iran, and perhaps our embassy would be threatened and hostages would be taken. And of course, he was right. Anyway, he resisted these entreaties for, throughout 1979 until in late October, Cy Vance finally changed his mind because he was given the information that the Shah was sick with cancer and needed treatments at Sloan Kettering in New York. And of course, this actually turned out to not be it was bad information. He could have gotten treatment elsewhere for his medical problems. But in any case, Carter finally relented and agreed the Shah could come. And then, of course, a few days later, the embassy was seized. And that crisis, the hostage crisis, lasted 444 days. And it, was very debilitating politically.
Right. And then particularly when in 1980, Carter launched a rescue attempt that failed spectacularly and just made things worse.
Made things even worse. And of course, Zbig Brzezinski was the guy who was planning that helicopter rescue mission and was relentless again in lobbying Carter to do something in a military way. And again, Carter resisted for many months, but out of frustration, finally in April of 1980, he gave the go-ahead. And of course, it was such a complicated operation. It was, I argue that it was doomed to failure. It was never going to succeed.
Yeah. And then around got him back by hanging on to the hostages until right after Reagan's inauguration.
Down to the minute.
Down to the minute. I remember the, just television coverage all that day from the inauguration to the hostages, and it just was very clearly pointed.
Well, that brings us to the October surprise, which I devote a small chapter to in the biography. And again, this is a controversial chapter, but I argue that that William Casey, Ronald Reagan's campaign manager, traveled secretly to Madrid, Spain in late July of 1980, and met with a representative of the Ayatollah Khomeini, and essentially suggested that the Iranians should go slow on releasing the hostages because they get a better deal from his guy, Ronald Reagan. Now, I don't think Reagan himself was privy to this. This was sort of an off-the-book operation done by Casey himself, who was an old OSS intelligence operative and loved cloak and dagger stuff, and was perfectly capable of doing something like this. But it was, if it did happen, and I have some good documentary evidence that proves that he did go to Madrid, Spain for purposes unknown, according to us.
Fascinating.
It's just it's an incredible episode. And if it happened, it probably led to the prolonging the hostage crisis.
Right.
And, muddying the waters of the negotiations that Carter was involved in trying to get the release of the hostages. And, Casey succeeded in denying Carter the opportunity for a October surprise, a release of the hostages just before the election, which might have made a big difference because the election, was actually pretty close. People forget, they remember a landslide, and it was a landslide in the Electoral College, but up until 2 weeks before the November 80 election, Carter was within striking distance. He was within 5 points in the polls, which is often the margin of error. And, if he had been able to get the hostages released, if Ted Kennedy hadn't run against him, another episode in a very terrible year in 1980, Carter might have gotten reelected, and history would have been very different.
Right. You point out that it's tough to run for re-election when even all of his victories were politically unpopular. Panama Canal Treaty, SALT II, and Camp David. But you said you think that the deciding factor was the hostages.
I think the hostages. Carter, much to the annoyance of his wife, Rosalind, who actually had a very smart political nose and was constantly arguing with Jimmy, you've got to pay more attention to the politics. Can't you postpone, at one point, can't you postpone the Panama Canal Treaty until your second term? And Carter said, no, I've got to do the right thing. And this was his attitude. He could have, as we've discussed, he could be very ruthless politically in achieving power and winning power and campaigning. But he had this righteous sensibility about himself that compelled him to sort of, once he was in the Oval Office, he was determined to simply do the right thing and ignore the politics. He was constantly telling his aides, don't talk to me about the politics. Tell me, give me the facts on X or Y issue and let me deal with the politics. Well, he didn't want to deal with the politics. he was
Let me ignore the politics.
Yeah, so he was a very unusual politician in that way. In '76, he won the presidency with white rural Southern voters, with African American voters, with Jewish American voters, labor households, union household Americans who were members of labor unions voted by a majority for him. And with the exception of the African American community, he lost all of those constituencies in 1980, just 4 years later. And you look at like the Jewish American community, every Democratic presidential candidate routinely takes 70–80% of the Jewish vote. And Jimmy Carter did in 1976, he got 72% of it. And in 1980, he got only 45%. This is despite the fact that he had done Camp David. He'd taken Egypt off the battlefield for Israel. But he was perceived as being anti-Israeli.
Right.
Because he had continued to try to push the Israelis on the settlements issue.
Mm-hmm.
And, politicians like Ed Koch went after him, the mayor of New York, the very feisty and vocal mayor, went after Carter on this issue. And a lot of Jewish American voters just sat out the election or voted for Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
Very ironic. Likewise, his own home base, the South, turned its back on him.
Right.
And then, it was like Jimmy Carter was too good for them.
Well, that brings me to your closing words in the book, which I found fascinating. Perhaps Carter was too much of a Georgian Yankee for the New South and too much of a populist Southerner for the North. In either case, his presidency was ahead of the times. Carter's rise to power had offered hope for reconciliation between North and South and hope for healing of the racial divide. His loss signaled that the country was reverting to a new era of harsh partisanship, political division, and extremism. It was a tragic narrative of defeat familiar to any Southerner. So talk about the connection between Carter's loss and the tragic narrative of defeat.
Well, I think, again, coming back to Jimmy Carter's childhood, he really did grow up metaphorically just a few years after the Civil War. That memory of defeat and occupation was something that Carter himself didn't experience, but he lived it vicariously. People talked about the defeat throughout his childhood. He was very much aware of it. And this gave him a sort of sense of a pragmatic streak to him. He understood that not all wars end in victory.
Yeah.
And I think he's the first American president who sort of didn't believe in this notion of American exceptionalism, which is astonishing, for an American politician. He brought and I sort of admire him deeply for this. He brought a sort of realism to the office and an awareness of limits. This could translate into everything from understanding that we don't have money for everything. He was kind of a small town fiscal conservative, to his awareness of limits with regard to the environment. He was a big environmentalist, a sort of early climate change advocate. And in terms of foreign policy, it explains his reluctance to use military force, even though he'd been a Navy man. He'd had a career 7 years in the Navy, a graduate of the Naval Academy, protege of Admiral Rickover. But he'd quit the Navy after 7 years, partly because his father suddenly died and he felt he needed to come back to the family farm, but also because he, as he told one of his aides, Peter Bourne, he just he wondered whether it was the right thing for him to devote his life to weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. And so I think all of this was informed by his Southern roots and his realism, his awareness that of defeat and occupation, and it's a very Southern story, at least to my mind as a Northern Yankee.
No, I think you make a good case for that. Well, let's leave Carter aside for a minute, and I want to hear a little bit about your work as executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography. I love biographies and read a lot of them, and so I was interested in that.
Well, biography is, I think, just the best form of history. It's very accessible. Yeah. It draws the reader in, and it's a very, it's a human story that most people can understand, and you read a good biography, and along the way you learn a lot of history. Anyway, I've had this terrific gig for the last 4 years as the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography in New York City, which is a wholly unique institution. There's no other center devoted to promoting the art and craft of biography. And what we do is simply award 5 or 6 very generous fellowships every year to working biographers. They can be academics or a journalistic background or simply first-time biographers, and they get a fellowship of $72,000 and office space and access to library resources and an opportunity to sort of sit around once a month in a seminar and talk with other biographers about their mutual problems. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, we host 15 or 20 events a year where we invite a biographer to talk about their new book. Yeah,
that's wonderful.
So it's a great program, and it's wholly funded by one woman who just loves biography.
Good for her.
A very enlightened billionaire, Shelby Wright. So it's been going since 2007, and I've had the honor to direct it for the last 4 years. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm glad to know it's out there. A lot of the biographies I read are of artists and writers, and so there's a lot of adultery and madness and drugs, and yours was very different. Nothing along those lines except Willie Nelson smoking weed on the roof of the White House.
Right. Yeah. There is a little weed smoking in the White House, courtesy of the
Not by Carter.
Not by Carter, but by the sons. Yes.
Yeah. So what do you like to read?
Oh, I read a lot of biographies still. Here, I just finished reading this book, which is a biography of an American woman who was actually beheaded on the personal orders of Hitler for being a spy. The only American woman. I have to confess, I read very little fiction. My wife says that I'm socially ignorant as a result.
Well, you get a lot from a biography about human nature.
I like to say that a good biography is actually a novel. It's telling the biographer's point of view about this person's life story. And the only difference is that it's got a lot of footnotes.
Yeah. Well, which biographies do you wish you had written? What are the great ones?
Oh, well, I do admire Robert Caro's
Yes,
4 volumes now. Is he working on
I
his
think it's
5th?
like 6.
6th? And I could never have done 5 volumes on Jimmy Carter.
Thorough committed.
But Caro is sort of in a league all to himself in that way.
Mhm.
But there are, I also, in my own career, I've made a point. What draws me to biography is trying to understand sort of how power works in America. So my first biography was on John McCloy, this powerful Wall Street lawyer, who sort of seemed to grease the worlds between corporate America and the legal field and foundations and big government. And so I'm interested in how power works, and for the same reason I did a biography of the Bundy brothers, William and McGeorge Bundy.
Mhm.
Because I wanted to understand the Vietnam War, and these 2 brothers were major architects of the war, and they were liberals. And I couldn't understand as a young man how these, Harvard and Yale trained liberals could have gotten us into this terrible, tragic war that went on and on. So, I write for myself in the first instance, to try to simply understand for myself what happened. And if I, along the way, persuade a few people to read the book too, that's always good. But you write
Well,
for
I
yourself.
hope people will read The Outlier. It's a beautifully written, really thoughtful, complex and fascinating book. And I hope everyone who is listening who hasn't read it yet will pick it up. And this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much, Kai.
Thank you, Katie, for having me.
Absolutely.